Perfect. So we'll just start with an intro quick.
Sounds
and
good.
then we will kind of jump into it. Hey everyone, welcome to the Deep Dive Podcast presented by River Youth. I'm your host, Dilly, and today I'm joined with Tammy Lindell, who has years of experience in training people on how to have healthy relationships, how to lead better, how to live just the life to the full. So, Tammy, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself for the students that are watching?
Yeah, so I did young adult and youth ministry for about 13 years at River Youth, and now I just train nationally. I do some relationship skills and do more the train the trainer model, teaching others how to go out and help others have healthy relationships. My background is in pastoral counseling, and so I've had lots of experience with people in extremely high-risk situations and helping them walk through the relationships and come to healing and knowing the Lord. So, yeah.
Sure. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah.
So for those who are listening or watching, we're going to be talking about relationships today. Last episode we had Kirby on, talked about friendships. So this is kind of a nice natural progression. But we actually had some youth students send in questions anonymously to our Instagram to ask different questions they have. So for our episode today, we're going to try to get through as many of those as we can and hopefully be able to have a good conversation as we go. So let's start with kind of a big one right away.
Okay.
You ready for this?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So the question is, and we don't have to be too personal with this.
Okay.
But what is your biggest regret that you have in dating or in relationships?
Biggest regret. No, I'm a little old now, but isn't it true? Like some of the decisions we make when we're young just kind of carry with us.
Sure. Yeah.
You're still learning that.
I'm still learning that. No.
One of my biggest regrets, honestly, is not having standards for those who I dated. So I always kind of chuckle because like many times some of those clothing stores you'll see in the mall will say something like you hired, essentially like you're good looking, you're in the trend, you're hired. And that's kind of how we went about it. We found you appealing, and so let's just date, So not even having standards or getting to know them, it was just kind of like an automatic, you're mine, like we have a title. So I would say having standards, knowing that before going in, and also understanding like the difference of love versus infatuation, knowing that there is a major difference.
Yeah. What would you, for maybe a student who's listening, like, what did you just say? Infatuation. What's the difference between love and infatuation?
I would say the simplest form to break down love versus infatuation is love is other focused and infatuation is very self-focused.
Right.
So when you're talking about love, it's giving of yourself to others in ways that are God-honoring, Yeah. But when you're talking about infatuation, it's more like, what can you do for me? I feel empty, so how are you going to fill my void?
Yeah, very self-serving.
Right.
Right. Yep. I think for me personally, one of my regrets in dating or just in relationships or looking for relationships in general was I think at times a lack of contentment, because as a single person, like singleness is actually a very fun season of your life if you lean into it.
Right.
And I think for me, I was always looking at, okay, when am I going to be in a relationship? Where am I going to find my future spouse? And then you get into dating, like, okay, when can I get engaged? And then it's like, okay, how fast can I get married? So I think just learning to enjoy the season of life you're in while you're in that season and not wishing it away, because, dating is really a short period of your life.
Yeah.
Engagement, even though it feels like forever at times, is a short period of your life, but just enjoying that and, just growing in those seasons together. So,
what's interesting is when you're talking about having contentment through each of the stages, for each one of the stages that you mentioned comes greater responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And our young people want to always put a title on their relationship versus just enjoying getting to know that person and having your freedom and learning who you are in a relationship, even if it's just friendship. Like it's like that's a taboo or something. You can't just be present.
Yeah.
There's always got to be a title.
Yeah. And I think too, like, you don't understand how much pressure there is when you get into marriage when you're just a single person, because like all the things, like I always joke around with the Heartland students that marriage didn't erase my faults.
Right.
It accentuated them, because now everything that I do wrong, my wife's like, hey, shut the cupboards, hey, turn off the faucet, so like there's a lot of things that you have to work through individually before you get to that spot. And I think so often we want to short circuit that process, but
absolutely. It's more about what are you going to do for me versus what can I do for others?
right. Back to that love versus infatuation. Yeah. Here's a question, and want to hear your thoughts on. I have some thoughts on it too, but is it bad to date someone who isn't a Christian yet?
Well, don't they call that missionary dating?
Yeah, right. Missionary dating.
We think that we can just, go out with somebody, start dating them, and all of a sudden we can turn them to our ways. We invited them to youth. I mean, they're here. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think it does kind of the opposite more than it does the other side, because I've seen a lot of kids come to youth. They brought that significant other, and then now that kid becomes the Christian, and now this one's off doing things that they shouldn't be doing,
Yep.
But I think the smartest way to date is to know who they are beforehand and really understand your motive of why are you even dating, Christian or not? What is your motive of dating? And then if you think you're really ready to date and enter that, you got to know your standards and what's important to you long term, because like I said in the start of this, the relationships I had in high school, I mean, they shaped who I am today and why I do what I do today.
Yep.
So I think you really have to think about that. But I would not advise missionary dating.
Yeah, I don't think it works out. I think in the Old Testament, God told the people of Israel not to marry other cultures or other people with different belief systems, because he knew it would draw their heart away from him. And I think, in the New Testament, Paul says in 2 Corinthians, I think it's 6:14, like, don't be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. And just that idea of like two oxen in a yoke, if one of them is stronger than the other, they start to pull. Right. And I think our default as humans is our sinful nature, not our spiritual nature. And so there's always going to be that easy pull to the things of the world rather than the things of God. And so I think it's so important as a student who's considering who should I date, who should I future marry, looking at their character rather than just the charisma they have or the Hollister effect, where you look, man, they look like a model. That's great. You know, because eventually those things fade, and it's the heart, it's the character, it's the hard moments of life where you're going to have to go through those seasons with this person. You really want someone who loves and trusts God. So I think that's so important. Yeah.
And having that servant heart. And a lot of times when we're teenagers, especially, like, our focus is how are we going to get from one week to the next or day to day. We're not thinking about serving somebody else for the rest of our life, you know?
Absolutely. Here's a funny one. Pickup lines that always work. And I think I'm just going to answer this one right away. Instead of trying to pick someone up, you should probably pick up your Bible and learn what God's word says, and learn how to be a good person of character, a person who can serve others. Work on becoming the right person before you try to meet the right person, because if you're the wrong person, even if it's the other person's, awesome, you're going to be undesirable. So I wouldn't try them. They don't work super well. Pick up your Bible instead. Here's a good one, though.
Okay.
Because we talked about in our series that only 2% of relationships that take place in high school or junior high end up staying together. Right. So 98% of those don't work out. And that's just a stat. We're not trying to discourage people, but the question is, why is it likely that you won't make it out of high school together if you're dating, even if you're in the same spot in your faith? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a lot of it is, when you're before your age 25, your prefrontal cortex is not even developed. So your ability to really see what life is going to look like long term is hard. Like you can even date in high school, have the best of intentions, be two Christians, following God, doing, relationship right, where you're with people, having accountability, building that trust, building that relationship. But once you get out, of high school, you don't have those pressures of all the things in school and in youth group, and all of a sudden you're just entering the stage of learning who you are, because while you're in high school,
Yep.
mom and dad are telling you where to go, what to do, what to be. You're under their morals, their guidelines, and then when you're a young adult, you're going to start to really try to figure out, is this who I am? Is this what I believe?
Yep.
And then in that process, your prefrontal cortex starts to go, so it can change everything about you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, looking at my life, the person I was when I was 18 versus the person I was when I was 21 even, or 22 or whatever, it's like I was, especially those first couple of years out of high school, I've learned a lot about who God was created me to be. Like,
Right.
you just change so much, and it's not to say that it couldn't work out, but I just think that as you get older, you're going to understand a lot more about yourself.
Right.
You're starting to make some of those very defining decisions that are going to really affect the next, 50 years of your life. So I think there's just a lot of unknown when you're in
Right.
high school. And so it's not to say that they couldn't ever work out, but
Right.
it's just one of those things where I think as you get older, you realize how much in life changes. And a lot of it is for good. But it just, I think there's a lot of change that happens between the time you're in high school and the time
Oh my
you
goodness.
graduate college.
Tons of change as you enter adulthood, and who you are in Christ is gonna just show like through everything that you experience. And as your brain can put it together, you're gonna be able to project that out there,
Yeah.
and understand where you want to go.
I mean, when I was in high school, I didn't even know what I was good at.
Right.
Like, I didn't even know what skills I had. There was a lot of identity yet to be discovered as I sought God. So I think, it's just hard to say like, oh, we're on the same page now. Because if you think about it, if you had two ships in the sea and they're going the same direction now, even if one is 1 degree off from the other, over the course of years, they're gonna really part. So I think it's easy to feel like I'm running the same race as someone now, but that can change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that scenario of those two ships, like, you have to do the work and be on track and pay attention to where those ships are going and if they're in alignment or not. Like, it's not just things that just happen. Like, you don't just fall in love. When
Right.
you say you fell in love, you couldn't help it. That's actually not true, especially according to the Bible. That God tells us to love others. It's a directive, so that's a choice that we make. We choose who we love. We choose who we hate.
Yep.
And so love is a choice. So you have to be conscious about loving somebody. You're always going to have those selfish feelings.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we're sitting in, school or in our youth group, we let that define who we are as if that's going to be our forever. And it's really, truly not. Like, nobody cares who you sat next to in youth group when you're going to get groceries once you graduate, or in high school. So you're kind of defining your life according to what you're seeing right before you. But in the long term, there's so much more life that you're going to live. That's actually, like you said, you're going to learn what you're more passionate about, what you're living for, what your purpose is, and what God has called you to do. And, sometimes we think in a moment, like, maybe this is my calling. Well, if it is, are you going to listen to God, or are you going to just go date somebody, because you're lonely and you're trying to fill your heart?
Yeah. And I think too, like, again, high school relationships, I think, are very popular, but and I don't remember, maybe I was talking to you the other day, even in the office, but just the idea that whoever you date, you're either going to marry them or you're going to break up with them. And like, that changes the way you look at every relationship you're going to be in. Because if you know, okay, this is either a forever thing or it's not, like, I think it changes the way, like, why am I doing this? Is this really something I want to be doing, I guess? So,
even at that, Dylan, think about those girls that maybe you liked. Those girls are going to be somebody else's future spouse. When you look at that, like, if you hurt them or don't respect their boundaries, they're taking that into their future.
yeah.
And so I always would challenge the kids, like, how would it be for you if somebody was actually considering your future spouse and not doing things that would hinder your future marriage?
Yeah.
That's like, again, going back to thinking forward about, this is the rest of my life, and what kind of burden do you want to have somebody carry?
Right. Yep. And yeah, just that goes back to the idea of loving someone selflessly, loving them the way Christ would love them, and not just trying to fulfill a desire that you feel in the moment. So you brought up boundaries, and I think that's one of our questions too. But what boundaries would you say for the students listening? Like, what are boundaries that should be set, and what are some practical tips that they can use, whether they're dating or about to date or thinking about dating? How can they set some of those boundaries?
Well, a lot of times when we think about the physical aspect, there's boundaries that go, way beyond anything even that's like physical touch or sex and things like that. Like, you should be respecting them with, holding hands and putting your arm around them, and having all that like touch stuff should be given permission, right? Mm-hmm. But a lot of us don't think about that there's emotional intimacy.
Right.
There's intellectual intimacy. Mm-hmm. There's spiritual intimacy. There's like many types of intimacy that you can have. And what happens is a lot of us get together with somebody and we just jump into the physical bucket. Mm-hmm. But there's so much more to be learning. And we think just entering into the physical realm will automatically make us close. But that's not true, actually. Right.
Yeah. Can you expound a little bit more on that? Because I think that's a really good, like, I think a lot of times we assume if I'm, if we're holding hands or we're kissing, like, that really shows how much I care for them.
Right.
But there's so much more dimensions to having a healthy relationship beyond that. So maybe just expound a little more on that, because I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of times we don't even think about that there's a progression, because what we're seeing in the world is people are just going from high to, like high physical intimacy. Like, there's a progression that should be happening, and there's permissions along the way. But before you even get into that place, which God has reserved for marriage, right?
Yep.
Because that's the safest place. And at that point, you should know if you're loving each other. But if you focus more on your intellectual intimacy, growing your brain, your mind, and understanding who God is in your life, and then getting to emotional, where you can see, are you stable? Are you okay? Like, can we even have a conversation? Do we like the same interests? Do we understand one another? But also having some emotional boundaries as well, because there's certain conversations and places you shouldn't be going. Like, it's not actually healthy to sit down with somebody and start pouring out your whole life story and all the bad things that happened to you. Like, that's not healthy. That's actually crossing an emotional boundary. That takes a lot of trust.
Right.
So when you share that information, you're like really potentially putting yourself in a hard position where you can be hurt, right?
Yeah.
And then you have social boundaries, like having, like, who are you okay to be around? Who are you not? My family, does my family accept you? Are you respectful towards them?
Yep.
Or are you encouraging me to go against my family?
Right. Yep.
So you have a whole social world. Are you taking me from the events that I'm signed up for at school, or the extracurricular activities, or my sports, or whatever, or even youth? Am I skipping youth now? So you have to start thinking about that stuff. And then you can keep going. Even money. How are they with money? Mm-hmm. That's a big thing. The number one thing marriages fight over is money.
Right.
So know how they handle money before you ever get there. So I think dating can be super fun if you do it in the proper context.
Yep. Yeah. And like on that with boundaries and I always thought when I started dating Mackenzie, my wife, I thought this should add to my friend circle, not take away from it. 'Cause I see a lot of couples, they all of a sudden become exclusive, and it's like they're in their own little social bubble, and it's like they isolated themselves socially, which is actually the opposite of what you should be doing, which is, when I started dating Mackenzie, I was like, great, I have more friends. When we started dating, she has more friends, because hopefully we're similar and we're able to connect with the same types of people. And I think, just making sure that you have some boundaries, because boundaries exist to protect us.
Right.
And they create an environment that's safe for us to explore without getting hurt or without putting ourselves in harm's way. And so I think there's so many more dimensions just than physical ones. I think obviously the physical ones are very important because, whether you open yourself up to emotionally or whether you open yourself up to physically, like, you have opened yourself up to be hurt or to have baggage in your future
Right.
relationships, So any though practical things you're like, hey, you should really think about this as in terms of boundaries.
Well, here's what I always say. Boundaries without a consequence is just a suggestion.
That's good.
So if you are setting boundaries and they do not respect them, you're teaching them how to treat you. You're teaching them that they can keep hurting you and that they can keep crossing these boundaries and that they're really not boundaries in your life.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the hardest things for us to do is to let go of somebody when they're crossing those boundaries because we want to be loved so badly.
Yeah, right.
But the reality of it is, there's only one water that'll really quench our thirst. And so we really, truly have to learn how to understand God's love for us because that truly is the only one that's going to quench our thirst.
Right.
And as a teenager, that's hard to even sometimes process because it's not tangible.
Yeah.
So the more you dive in and understand what God's calling of you and what what are the boundaries he has placed on you, and do you trust those?
Yeah.
Do you trust them enough to actually live them? Because they're not suggestions. They actually come with consequences.
Right.
And he loves us enough to let us have consequences. But those consequences, you can learn from them or you can just keep compiling them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. That kind of leads me to one of the questions we got is how do you say no to someone, obviously probably a boyfriend, girlfriend, if they're pressuring you to go further than you would like to go?
That's a huge red flag because that indicates to me that they're more there for what they can get from you, especially physically.
Yeah.
And if somebody truly cares about you, they would never, ever, I don't care if it's a best friend, a boyfriend, or girlfriend, they would never ask you to do things that would hurt you in the future.
Right.
And there are so many consequences from that type of intimacy. And yes, you can heal from them, but God does allow us those consequences. So you are going to have to walk through that and learn how to get back to what I just said about how God loves you and getting in those boundaries.
Yep.
But like if somebody is asking you to do things more than you're comfortable with, I know it's hard, but that's one of those boundaries that don't make it just a suggestion. There's got to be a consequence to that. And it would really make me question, do you really love me? Or do you just love what I can do for you?
Right. Yep.
And anytime somebody says, if you love me, you would.
Yeah. Total lie. Absolute lie. Yeah. Because if they loved you, again, marriage relationship should model the relationship that we have with God.
Right.
And what did God do? He came to the earth to die for us,
Right.
to be to give us the most selfless gift possible. So if someone says they love you, true love is willing to wait. True love is willing to put you first.
Right.
And I think if they're trying to do that, it's obvious that they are infatuated with you. They lust over you, but they don't really care about you. And I think
Absolutely.
that's a good time to reevaluate that relationship.
Yeah. And that's another reason why you should keep your friends because, if only 2% is making it into marriage, like, oh my goodness, if you isolate yourself, now when you're done with that person, who do you have around?
Yeah, you have no significant other and you have no friends.
No, and that's actually, I was going to say earlier, that is a huge red flag. If you are losing your friendships because of your dating relationship, that is a huge red flag. And if your family and friends are saying things that they're not, in agreement of this relationship, a lot of times we just ignore what they're saying and keep going down that track. Mm-hmm. But that is one of the biggest red flags there are. And I would strongly suggest learning what God says about love in 1 Corinthians. Mm-hmm. Go to chapter 13, learn what he says, and understand what true agape love is, because that's what your friends and family are probably trying to do for you.
Yep, for sure. I think a lot of times we give our parents a hard time because they're they crack the whip on us. But, being a parent now, it's like there's not a single thing in this world I would not do to help my daughter sail out. And
right.
I think as a child, you have to just remember they're not just trying to bust your chops and make your life hard. They really do care about you, even if they don't know how to show it at times.
Right.
And so it's good to have a mentor. It's good to have family and friends just to be a sounding board to say, hey, I think that maybe this person is not who they say they are, or they need to develop their character or whatever. So unless you have one final thought on this, but I just want to close with one more question since we're kind of running out of time here. And we'll make this one kind of, this is kind of a fun one. We talked about this earlier, but should dating couples do devotions together?
Yeah, we kind of had to hash that one out a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, if you're talking college age and you're looking for a lifelong partner, I would say, yeah, do devotions together. But if you're in high school, I personally believe it would be more appropriate to do like Bible studies together, like get into youth group Bible studies and be around others.
Yeah.
And like, if you want to talk about a certain book of the Bible or something like that, but devotions to me takes it to such a personal level that unless you're actually willing and ready to get married, that's going to create one of those spiritual ties. And that would be my concern.
Yeah. I think it was C.S. Lewis that said, we're not physical beings with spirits, we're spiritual beings with bodies.
Right.
And so I think opening that door to create that soul tie with someone, even praying together, that's like super great if you're married, you know, you're engaged, like spending that quality time and devotions together is really important. So building that habit's great. But I think if you're in high school or early on in your relationship, you're better off, I think, to do your own devotional time, learn what God is speaking to you, and do group things together, the Bible studies, or do a reading plan together. That's great because you don't have to do that face to face, but not putting yourself in a spot where you're going to open a spiritual door into that person's heart and then leave yourself vulnerable or them vulnerable for future hurt. So I think we kind of eventually agreed on that one.
Yeah, definitely. I think, because when I think of devotional, I think of that those are such personal life questions or devotions to how you live your life as a Christian and with Jesus, which is great. That's great. Those are all really great things. But until you're ready to really see the character of somebody for a lifelong partnership, I think in that I had told you, like, the two most important decisions you're going to make is what you're going to do with Jesus and who you marry. And the first one is the most important one that's going to guide the second one. So you have to learn, am I living for Christ? Because if you are, then that devotion should be between you and Christ, you know, and learning who you are and building your character before you can start to get to know somebody else's character for a lifelong partnership.
And that whole word devotion really, we'll just kind of close with this, is I'm devoted to God. And it starts with that. Every good relationship we have with people needs to start with a healthy relationship with God. So awesome. Well, thanks, Tammy, so much for being on, and we hope you guys enjoy this episode. If you guys have ideas for future episodes, let us know. We'd love to cover those topics. But until then, we'll see you guys next month.